this display screen there?
I am. Yeah, Lacey has the meeting will start shortly, unless that's you.
That's me. So I just wanted to make sure my screen was coming through. So
Yeah,
it's 12 o'clock. So I think we ought to get started.
great.
Okay. Welcome everyone to the second of 3 community meetings to look at the Bozeman Community Plan. Today's meeting is going to focus primarily on the future land use map and the portions of the plan that are related to that. There are, hopefully on your screen are some poll questions to help you be able to get a chance to identify the whether you had a chance to look at the document or otherwise become familiar with it. That will simply help us understand what information we may need to help share. And I'm getting a note that I'm invisible. Let's see.
Yeah, I'm not showing up either, but I don't have an option to turn my video on.
Well, hopefully that will change when I stop sharing my screen. And in the meantime, we'll just look at the screen. So, as I mentioned, my name is Chris Saunders, and the purpose of this presentation is to help folks be aware of the comprehensive plan update, the growth policy update. The city's had a comprehensive plan or growth policy since 1958, and this is the 7th version we're completing. This process has been handled primarily to this point by the planning board. There's a citizen committee that is charged in the law with preparing this kind of a document. They're appointed by the city commission, and they make their recommendation to the city commission. That recommendation is what we're presenting to you today, and the city commission will be holding public hearings on that beginning in October. The process has been had 4 major steps as shown on the slide there. The input from the public has been a significant part of this process at each of those stages and has strongly influenced the direction and content of the plan. The city has used a variety of outreach tools to get to a wide variety of people, everything from one-on-one conversations, social media, all kinds of other things to try and reach broadly and deeply into the community. We are at this stage. The community plan's been under development for approximately 2 years, as shown on the screen there. And we're getting close towards getting a final decision from the City Commission. So what is the community plan? First of all, it is a longer range document. It does look at a 20+ year horizon. One thing I'd like to emphasize is that it is a plan. It is not a guarantee. All kinds of things influence the outcomes that we plan for in Bozeman. And so there are undoubtedly going to be some things where there are adjustments that are needed, and that's fine. We will review this document about every 5 years and just make sure it's still up to snuff for what it's needed. And if needed, we'll make some adjustments. These plans do cross-connect with a lot of other planning that the community does for things like transportation, housing, climate action, all kinds of other issues. So because those other documents are existing and of their own right, we don't try to put everything into the growth policy. There's more of an emphasis in this version based solely on land use because there are these other documents which previously had been addressed in the growth policy but now have their own documents. This document will replace the current growth policy that was adopted in 2009. That document will simply be retired if this document is adopted. And we do use the community plan in a variety of different ways. It presents a large overall community vision on development. We make no pretense that it will address everybody's primary concerns or even that everybody will agree about everything. There is a diversity of opinions and thoughts about land use development in the community, and we've tried to reach out and understand those as much as we can in bringing this forward. But this document will serve as the shared opinion and presentation of the community's priorities. It does help give us a framework as the City Commission and planning staff and others look at land development proposals. This does help us evaluate those and also help shape the regulations that guide those. So growth in Bozeman is not a new thing. As shown here, for the last 50 years, it's been almost a continuous upward trend. There was one drop there in 1990. The growth has varied, but even in the last recession, which was a very severe one, we still continued to see population growth. We don't believe there's any reason that that will change at this stage. And so there are some assumptions that growth will continue. Again, it's not a guarantee, but based on all the information that we have available, we believe the community will continue to change, but we can influence those changes. And so the part of the big piece of the plan is to try and direct growth and change in a direction that the community sees as suitable. So I'd like to talk briefly about what is actually in the document itself. There are 5 chapters and several different appendices. Each of the chapters touches on a specific thing. Chapter 1, basics, as it alludes to, is just the simple orientation and high-level summary of things. Chapter 2, themes, discusses the high-level ideas that we heard from the public and organized the document. And with each theme, there are associated goals and objectives and action steps that will help carry out those items. Each theme also includes a statement of importance to try and explain why and what is attempted to be accomplished with that theme. Future land use, where we're going to spend most of our time today, is looking at the future land use. Chapter 4 talks about implementation, what steps are going to happen to carry out the plan. Chapter 5 looks at amendments, and we'll spend a moment there in this presentation, and then the appendices dig deeper into things like the public outreach process, trend analysis, projections for future needs, those kinds of things. So chapter 2, the themes, has 7 items included in it. Each, as I mentioned, has a specific priority statement or statement of importance and associated goals. These 7 themes influence quite a bit the future land use map. And so there's a strong connection back and forth between some of the themes in different ways, but they all tie back in some form or fashion to the future land use map, whether that's the intent and purpose or the actual layout itself. When we move on to chapter 3 and start looking at what is the same and what is different with the future land use map this time than it was in 2009, several items immediately come up. One is the planning board has consolidated the number of different future land use designations. We've gone from 12 to 9. As part of that evaluation, the board had determined that there were some, such as business park, which no longer fit the themes and objectives that the city had, and so those were removed from the map and an alternate was put in its place. Some items stayed very similar, but they changed the name, and we'll talk about one of those in just a minute with urban neighborhood. The designation on the future land use map looks at the entirety of the planning area. The planning area is about 70 square miles in total, and all of it has some designation or another for one of the future land uses. One of the key elements, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, is that the future land use map is looking for a very, very long-term future. It looks at well beyond the 20-year trend analysis that was done, and we'll talk about why that is in a minute. The planning board also is recommending some increased implementation on the future land use map. They're specifically asking the City Commission to invest the resources to implement the future land use map. There's some specific actions that they call for. In the past, much of the future land use implementation has occurred on a parcel by parcel basis as private property owners have chosen to change the property. And the planning board is suggesting a more holistic approach with this version of the document. So we're going to talk about two of the future land use designations just as examples. This is the first one, urban neighborhood. There's several components for each of these designations. One is there is a little color swatch here. That's to help you locate and identify that use on the future land use map. There's a title and then the text, which gives a very high level description of essential characteristics of that designation. And then there are several images from the local community usually to help explain in a visual way some of the ideas that are behind that designation and help people just visualize what it might look like on the ground. In this case, this designation specifically integrates in with three of the themes that I mentioned earlier: neighborhoods, mobility, and regional coordination in different forms or fashions. For example, regional coordination, this recommendation includes annexation may need to happen before people develop in this kind of a characteristic area. There's also a variety of other connections from this document out to other community plans, such as the Community Action Plan, Housing Action Plan, which encourages a diversity of housing styles and opportunities to address different housing needs for folks. This document also encourages a variety of housing opportunities. That's not a new proposal. That's something that has been in the city's planning documents for quite a few years, but it is a refined emphasis and one of the connection points to some of our other planning documents. The second example for the future land use map is regional commercial and services. Again, a little color swatch there with that darker red color, short text description, and then some local images. Regional commercial and services, as an example, is the most intensive of the commercial activities that we identify in the community. It includes the types of uses such as large-scale medical at the hospital, large retail with Kenyon Noble, or offices for other kinds of services, where we expect that the services may be provided to people well beyond even the city limits and draw from throughout the larger area. Because of that, these kinds of areas tend to be located near major transportation corridors, and they provide a pretty wide range of alternatives for folks to use as far as land uses. So they are significant, and they also influence the community as a whole. As we go through and look at applying each of these future land use designations to the map, that is an important step, but it also ties into how the city does zoning. Table 4 from Chapter 3 is the place where it lines out how do the future land use designations correlate to the implementing zoning. So for example, the yellow line here, urban neighborhood, you can see there's a number of highlighted little squares here around each dot. Each of those dots is a zoning district where it's a possibility that that might be a good use for property if somebody wanted to look at developing it. I would note there's a broad variety there. There's no guarantee that just because something is in one of those yellow boxes there, that it would automatically be approved. Zoning follows the growth policy. So this is only a first step in looking at zoning changes. That is a separate legal process and has to be done independently. There's a similar chart to this in the current growth policy that does the same kind of coordination effort. Second example that I showed you, regional commercial and services. Again, the outlined boxes would be the implementing zoning districts that might fit into that category. So this is an illustration that is in the growth policy document itself, and it is striving to help folks understand how the growth policy interacts with the other land use regulations and processes for the city. The growth policy is the foundation. It's by law, not a regulation, but it sets very broad policy statements. When folks do look at things like zone map amendments, they do need to be in conformance with the growth policy. So it has a direct effect, but it is not a guarantee one way or the other. When someone moves forward into actually seeking to develop a piece of property with something like a subdivision to create new homes, that proposal then has to conform both to the zone standards that have been applied as well as to the growth policy broadly. So as we start looking into the map itself, I wanted to step back just for a second. As the city looks at its future land use planning, all of planning happens within a larger context. In this case, Bozeman's planning area is shown there in the darker gray color. The city of Belgrade has the lighter gray color. Interestingly enough, they're about the same size. And then the county actually does land use planning in the area over by Four Corners and surrounding both communities. But it's not just the way that the planning happens, it's also what's accumulated over time. This map looks at the way that property has been subdivided in the area around Bozeman. Bozeman's planning area is outlined there in green. The white area is the actual city limits. All of the colored shaded areas that you see, if it's a yellow stripe, it is public ownership. If it's blue, it is a conservation easement, and everything else, the yellow and red and orange, are property sizes. So those small areas there in red are showing that there's been significant development that's happened around the perimeter of the city. Red is the smallest, has lots that are 5 acres or less. And we'll zoom in there to see that a little more clearly. So Gallatin County has legal land control over these areas. The city plans out there for coordination, but there continues to be growth and development that happens outside the city limits that have significant influence on what the city can do. And when we look at the parcel counts, how many of what kind of pieces of land are out there, we see that there's almost 4,000 parcels that are under 5 acres, and there's only 148 that are over 40 acres. So most of the area surrounding the city has already been broken down from large agricultural tracts. And that kind of analysis is something we haven't been able to effectively do in the past, but with the growth and improvements in technology and information services that are available, we're able to look at these kinds of issues. We've worked with Gallatin County in many ways to help steer growth towards the city rather than having it out on a fringe. But when we look at the context of what happens around a community, it is the cumulative effects of well over 100 years worth of decision making. So when we start looking at what's happening for the future, our future land use map, one thing that's a significant change this time from the last time is this map is not limited in time. Previously in the past, the city went to a lot of effort to try and predict how much growth might happen and where it might go physically on the ground. This time around, in part based on that analysis I just showed you about existing development, we looked at it and said, there's so many variables here that are happening. We do not want to try and play the guessing game. So this map looks at the very long term and says, if this property changes, then this is the direction the city would like to see it go. If the landowner chooses to leave it as it is today for the next 100 years, that's just fine. There's no issues there at all from our standpoint. But if they choose to change it from what it is, we do want to be able to give them some indications. When the city does its future land use planning out here, we've also already done transportation planning and planning for water and sewer services. So we know what areas we can service and how much work it'll take for us to get there. And this kind of planning outwards also allows us to coordinate with other agencies like Gallatin County and the fire districts as we work on putting things together. So a couple of things that this land use map does. It does guide zoning decisions. When the city looks at a zone map amendment or a land development proposal, this makes a difference. It shows what the city's expectations are. So if whether it's a property owner, another agency, we can coordinate, we can think about how things might fit together over the long run. What it doesn't do, it does not change anybody's existing zoning. It does not annex any property, and it does not require anyone to develop. This is looking at the future. Because of the size of this map, it's very difficult to print on just a small page. And so our expectations is that we will be primarily accessing this through the city's website, and I'll show you how to do that in a little bit. We have our current future land use map integrated into other community computer systems that are available to the public, and folks tell us that it's very helpful for them to use. So, as I mentioned, a plan is not a guarantee. The future land use map can be amended. There are processes for that, and Chapter 5 describes what the criteria and process would be for doing those kinds of amendments. So if you're interested in how that might change, you might want to take a look at Chapter 5. Those same amendments also apply for changes to the text of the map as well. So what comes next? We're currently doing, as I mentioned, the series of meetings. We had one on the 16th. That recording is available through the city's website on the project page for the community plan. We're having this one today, and then there'll be another one on September 30th at 5 p.m. And we encourage folks to attend all or any of those as they see fit. On October 6th, the City Commission will begin their work sessions and public hearing to take input on this and consider what, if any, changes they wish to make prior to taking a final action. If you're looking for the document, it's available at bozeman.net/communityplan, and it's also available through the city's website, bozeman.net. If you go to City Projects and then to Bozeman Community Plan Update, it will take you to the plan, and you will be able to read the entirety of the document as well as review the future land use map. We are encouraging public comments. The plan is not done. It has reached a stage, certainly, but it is still subject to modification. Public input has significantly shaped the plan so far, and we expect that it will continue to do that. And I'm going to quickly show you how to get to the future land use map. I can get this to work. There we go. So city projects, community plan update, here you are. There's the plan map, or the plan draft itself, the appendices, and if you go to the future land use map, it will look just like this. If you're interested in a particular area, you can zoom in or out in order to find what you're looking for. You can also put in a specific address, and it will take you right there. If you click on that property you're interested in, it will tell you what the current designation is for 2009, and then it will also tell you what the future is. So you can see what is staying the same, what is changing. You can check any part of the community's map that way. And then you can look at that land use designation name, and you can compare that and read the draft of the text in Chapter 3 to get better information on what that is. So that is my presentation that I have for you. right now, and I would be glad to take any questions that folks may have. Lacey will read those off. There's a question and answer box that should be in your, well, it's in the lower right corner on my computer screen. I'm not sure where it might be on yours. But if you open that up, you can select a question, and Lacey will read those off, and then Tom and I will give you some answers on that. Lacey, take it away.
Thanks, Chris. We do have a few questions. The first one is from Carol Dismore asking, does the population include the donut area or just within the current city limits?
The slide that I showed you with the chart, that is only city limits.
Okay, the next one is from Jane Rushman. She's asking if you could tell us how the city plans to work with the county in the donut area. What type of jurisdiction does the city have for making and or enforcing any decisions outside of the city limits?
Very good question. The city interacts with the county on a lot of different levels, everywhere from mutual aid agreements with the local fire districts and the City of Bozeman Fire Department, shared health department, a lot of other things. Specifically in land use, the City of Bozeman legal jurisdiction stops at the city limits. Everything outside of the city limits that's inside of our planning area is advisory until such point as the property annexes. We do work with Gallatin County planning staff on a regular basis, and the City of Bozeman, the City of Belgrade, and Gallatin County all have members on what's called the Planning Coordinating Committee. That group is charged specifically with being an information clearinghouse and exchange for the local governments to be able to share information with each other and help coordinate policy. Earlier this year, the three respective governing bodies all approved what's called the Triangle Community Plan. That's available through the Gallatin County Planning Office website. And that document was put together over the course of about 2 years from the three jurisdictions, and it talks about how those three jurisdictions will coordinate and share common policies in certain areas. Doesn't line up for everything, and each jurisdiction will implement some of those policies slightly differently depending on their obligations. But there are many, many points of coordination relating to land use in that document.
Thanks, Chris. Next question is from Amy Hoitzma asking where she can find the transportation plan.
The transportation plan is available under the engineering division. So if you go under the bozeman.net and then government, it'll bring up all the departments list. And if you go under engineering, they'll have a link that takes you to transportation as well as a number of other facility planning documents.
Okay, and you might have touched on this. Lorraine Reed asks, how does this plan connect to the current county plan?
The current county plan, I'm going to draw a distinction between two things. One, the actual current county plan is very old, but they're in the middle of developing a new one. And so the city is quite a bit ahead in the plan preparation process. We have been exchanging information with the county as we've gone through this process. What the county will ultimately choose to do as far as priorities, we don't know yet, but they have adopted the triangle plan, like I mentioned, and that does have some overlap on the west side of Bozeman. And I expect those will significantly influence what the county ultimately decides to do with their overall plan as well.
Okay, Carol Dismore says, I saw that annexation will not happen. Did I see that right? I don't understand how planned urban neighborhoods would work if the land is not annexed.
The plan itself does not force anyone to annex. if someone's going to develop at an urban scale, it strongly encourages people to annex before beginning development. So it's more of a timing question than I think anything else. So yes, the city strongly encourages annexation. This plan continues that if people are choosing to develop.
Okay, and then Jerry DeMarco says, my first concern regarding the map is that the downtown area not grow beyond its present boundaries, ideally Babcock to Mendenhall, Broadway to 3rd, or any higher. To allow the downtown to expand further would put upward pressure on surrounding land values, which works against affordable housing goals.
Okay, that sounded more like a statement than a question, but
Might have been a comment.
yeah, I will note there are some adjustments to the B3 or to the downtown plan boundary. They are mostly fairly minor. They do affect mainly fringe areas where there was already a portion of a block, which was included in the traditional core and something else. Typically, if we can, we prefer to have boundaries fall on a street. It provides a physical separation between different uses, which helps to limit conflict. So there were some changes, and you can see that on the future land use map as I showed, but most of it is staying exactly the same.
And that's all we have in the Q&A feature here. I'm looking for any raised hands. Which you can also find in the lower right-hand corner. If you are not able to type your question into the Q&A field. Oh, there we go. Okay, Lorene Reed asks, how did you determine the parks and open spaces area?
The areas that are shown on the future land use map for parks and open lands are pretty much all the ones that already exist. So we looked at existing subdivision plats and other developments approvals that had happened. And if it had been set aside, we designated it that way. When we look for the future areas where the development has not yet occurred, we did not attempt to place future parks. Future parks will be required. That's a state law requirement with new subdivisions and a city requirement for anything that's not a subdivision for residential uses. So we know that there will be parks out there. However, we do not have enough information at this point to say a park in the future should go over here. So what you're seeing as parks and open lands is mostly what is already in existence.
Okay.
Good question, though.
Amy Hoitzma is following up on her transportation plan question. She's asking if the most recent transportation plan is in fact from 2017.
It is. Yeah, previous to that was, I think, 2007. But 2017 is the most recent plan, yes.
Okay, and then we have a question. Will city have a way to avoid or not allow the creation of new donut holes with county lots surrounded by future city lots?
The city does have two alternatives there. One is we do choose where we can annex. It is the city's policy at this point primarily for the landowner to come to the city and request annexation. But we also, as part of that policy, specifically say we want to avoid creating new wholly surrounded areas. So that would be one thing. The other option is there is legal authority under Montana law for the city to initiate annexation in certain circumstances. They're limited circumstances, but it is possible. The city has considered that idea. The city has not committed to doing it. So number one, we want to try and prevent them from happening in the future by careful annexation decisions.
Okay. Carol Dismore asks, what info do you have on planning for expanded use of water?
Lots and lots and lots and lots and lots, actually. The city probably does more water planning than anything else because you have to deal with it when it comes in, you have to deal with it when it goes out, and then you have to deal with it when it falls out of the sky. So the city has, I think it's 26 separate plans, including the growth policy. In that list includes a wastewater plan, a water plan, water conservation plan, integrated water resources plan, and a stormwater plan. The city has made substantial efforts over the last roughly 7 years to implement its water conservation plan and has seen pretty significant success. We're in the middle of getting started on an update to the sewer service plan. One of the things that many folks may not know is that there are very heavy federal regulations both on the intake of water and also discharge of water. And we have a very small receiving stream, which is the East Gallatin. So our ability to pass wastewater through our treatment plant, we do a really, really good job treating it, but it has very high standards, is just as much a potential limitation on ability to grow as the ability to obtain more water to put into the system. So the city does water planning. I believe the last water facility plan was looking at a 50-year horizon for how much we thought we would use as population growth continued, assuming that it did, what would it take to serve it? And so we looked very carefully and on a very long time cycle for that issue. We strongly encourage conservation. It's the least expensive thing to do. But at some point, we will need to look at supply increases.
Okay.
And if folks want to see all of those lots of plans, those are also under the engineering division. So if just where the transportation plan was, you can also find the water, wastewater, et cetera, kinds of documents. They will also be linked in the growth policy text. If you look in Appendix B, there is a description of each of those plans and a link that takes you to their current location.
And Chris, we have a question from Lisa Kirk. It may have been sent to you directly. I'm wondering if my version is truncated. It says, extending into Iker Creek to northeast of Meadowbrook Estates, wildlife resource area that has not been accounted for, possibility to reconsider green space? Question mark. What about bike route development? Okay, so it might be, what about bike route development extending into Iker Creek to northeast of Meadowbrook Estates?
Okay. Some folks did send me some questions directly on a chat, so I can answer that. Yeah. So question number one: how does urban neighborhood designation influence property currently designated suburban residential? How does this process influence established HOA covenants? So first part of the question, suburban residential was one of those categories that the planning board chose to remove from the plan. So the urban neighborhood was the next closest fit, and so it was applied. So it does not ultimately change much of anything. The priority that says you should annex before development existed under the old suburban residential designation. It exists under the urban neighborhood designation. So probably doesn't make a big difference there. The question about influencing homeowners association covenants. HOA covenants are private contracts. Those are not something that city intrudes in, both by practice and by law. The ability to enter into a covenant is something that's protected. And so if somebody has a covenant, that's a matter for them civilly to enforce. The city is also not bound by those covenants. So if the city and the landowner or HOA disagree, the city's able to do what we do within the bounds of the law. And we're not going to tell the HOA what they can't do on theirs, but there can be conflicts. There was a question on park areas and new urban neighborhoods, and I think that's been described and answered. There's one that says noting industrial designation extending into Acre Creek to northeast of Meadowbrook Estates. Wildlife resource area not been accounted for, possibility to reconsider green space. Okay, couple of comments there. One, broadly speaking, given the scale of the map, the city did not make an attempt to depict individual wetlands or watercourse locations across the entire area. We did take a look at that, and trying to print it basically ended up with something that was unreadable. However, when folks look at the map against the background information through the city's computer system, you can go in and look. If there are mapped water courses and things like that, they are visible. So you can see the correlation there. If there is an overlap and somebody proposes development as part and parcel of any development proposal, they have to delineate any wetlands, they have to identify any water courses or other kinds of things like that. And there are regulations in place to protect that, regardless of what the category of the future land use map may be. That's an underlying requirement. So if there is an area, whether it says residential or industrial or public institutions, if it says stream, then it's going to be a stream. And that will be field verified and followed up on during the development process. And then the last one that got sent to me was about bike routes. Bike route development is something that's handled through the transportation planning. And there's a significant section in there about that. For quite a few years, the city's had a priority in its land use planning and development standards to encourage and require development of pedestrian and bicycle facilities as a minimum standard. There's nothing here that's going to change that. And so that continues to be in place. And the city provides funding and support with each new road project to ensure that those facilities get installed.
Okay, I have a few more here.
Okay.
Lorraine Reed asks, are riparian, I'm probably pronouncing that incorrectly, are riparian and wetland included in parks and open space?
Okay, I missed that. I got bad ears, I think. Can you read that one again?
Are riparian, R-I-P-A-I-A-N.
Oh, riparian. Okay, got it.
Thank you. And wetland included in parks and open space.
There are parks that include wetlands and watercourses and riparian areas, yes. We did not attempt to draw a designated boundary along all of those, as I was just mentioning. There is some information out at a very large scale about locations for wetlands and undeveloped areas. It's pretty coarse, more coarse than we were comfortable with using as a land use map tool. So as I mentioned, it is something that will be looked at in detail as any proposals move forward for somebody to develop a piece of property.
Okay, and I'm going to switch over. I've received some questions via private chat as well. Some we've addressed. Okay. Last week, Mr. Rogers mentioned upzoning as a possibility. Why and how would this occur?
Good question. There is a portion of Chapter 5 that discusses that process. Upzoning is the process where the city commission could approve an amendment to the zoning map from a less to a more intensive designation of some sort. The city has looked at probably 75 requests in the last 5 to 6 years for zoning changes, and I think 72 of those got approved, and most of them were upzones. Generally, a private party would ask for one because they think there's an opportunity for development that their current zoning prevents them from doing that they would like to do. The plan document includes, again, for the first time, some specific criteria that the city commission might look at in deciding whether or not the city itself should initiate a change to the zoning map for something to be more intensively zoned. The reason the city might want to look at that kind of a process would be multiple fold. One, there may be zoning which was put in place. The city started zoning in 1934, so we've done it for a long time. The community is very different. So there may be zoning in place which actually doesn't match to the existing use of the property. It may be in conflict with the future land use map. It may be creating an impediment to some other policy of the city. And so the city commission may look at that as a reason. There are specific requirements in state law where the city has to account for those in order to approve any kind of a zone map amendment. And there is some information, again, in Chapter 5 that talks about how the city thinks about those criteria. Nothing in the growth policy is a guarantee of a change, one way up, down, or to leave it the same. But the language that's in Chapter 5 is there to provide some guidance and understanding. If it says, for example, impacts on transportation, it's very difficult to do anything when you have a vacant field that is not going to result in increased transportation needs. However, the city also has standards in place for ensuring people build roads in the right spot and traffic lights go in place as needed. And so when we look at those kinds of map amendments, we're looking holistically at the entire system, the future land use map, the zoning criteria, and all the regulations that will apply to any future development in reaching the conclusions that ultimately the city commission makes. And they have some latitude to decide to pursue or not pursue any particular change to the zoning map. If they want to, they can leave it exactly the way it is.
Okay. Jane Richmond asks, could you explain more about future potential annexations and how that process might work, especially for existing subdivisions that do not have an HOA?
Okay. The current policy of the city, which was updated just end of last year, is to encourage the private landowner to approach the city and initiate the process. And that's the same whether they're on the edge of the city or a wholly surrounded area or whatever. The city prefers to annex groups of property. It's the same amount of work generally for us to annex one property as 10. So if there's a group of folks that could come in together, oftentimes it's easier to do it as a group. The process itself is largely driven by state law. So the application materials that are requested are all the things the city needs to conduct its analysis and make decisions based on facts. So there is a formal application form and materials that an applicant would submit. A city would receive that, would conduct our analysis. There are public notices that are required to tell folks what's happening and give them an opportunity to comment prior to the city commission making a decision. If the city commission says yes, then typically what happens is there is an annexation agreement which is prepared, which says we do this, you do that. With a private property owner, there's an adopting ordinance, an adopting resolution that executes that. Rough time frame for all of those steps is 6 months, start to finish. A lot of times folks annex for one of two reasons. Either they're interested in future development for a vacant or underdeveloped property, or they're concerned that their septic system is going to fail. And having worked with a few folks whose septic system failed in the middle of winter, that is an ugly situation. And so it's definitely one of those things where people need to take care of their septic systems and they need to get ahead of that game. But if there is an HOA, that really doesn't make a big difference. The homeowners association generally does not own the property unless there's, for example, a common open space that is part of a subdivision. So usually we are working directly with an individual landowner for specific parcels.
Okay, Lisa Kirk asks, how does urban neighborhood designation influence property currently designated suburban residential? How does this process influence established HOA covenants?
Okay, I answered that one with a chat that came to me. So I think we've got that. If there was a follow-up, let us know and we'll answer that as well.
I think you did answer that. And then maybe you answered this one too. Can we suggest changes to designation of park areas?
Anybody can suggest any change to any part of the plan at this stage. So if you wish to make a suggestion, whether it's to the text or the map, that can go into agenda@bozeman.net, or you can mail it to the P.O. Box 1230 for the city. Please explain specifically which thing you're interested in, what change you're interested in, and why. That makes it much easier for the city commission as they're considering the public comments.
Okay, and this one's related. What about pedestrian bike routes? Can you suggest changes to pedestrian bike routes?
You can suggest them. If you're looking for that, I'd suggest you send that directly. You can still send it to agenda, but please send it attention to the engineers. They're the ones who manage the street system. The growth policy generally does not get down to that level of detail. For folks who are interested in that issue, the Gallatin County is currently working on a trails plan, which covers the area called the Triangle, kind of between West Bozeman, Four Corners, and Belgrade. And so that might, if you're in that area of town, that certainly could be something you want to engage in as well, in helping to put the pedestrian network out on that west side. The city will do its part within its boundaries. We do have members of the city staff who are participating in that group activity, but it's under the charge of Gallatin County Planning.
Okay. Since water is such a highly monitored topic, why isn't there a way to measure it in monitoring and updating? Page 53, natural resources.
I'm going to go look at page 53, just a second. Oops, wrong one. Okay, so the reference there on page 53, that is in the section on monitoring and updates, which is part of the implementation chapter in chapter 4. One of the outcomes from this document the planning board has recommended is that the city adopt specific metrics to look at what is happening over time in the community. At this point, they have not identified a specific goal or method. They have identified a subject matter and a general trend that they see as appropriate. If the City Commission agrees with these kinds of indicators that were suggested, then the staff will work on finalizing that and getting those back before the City Commission with specific methods and means. The city does a lot of monitoring already, and so we will leverage that. We have really good meter data and other kinds of things that we can draw from. So it's just premature for us to have finalized exactly how we're going to do it yet.
Okay, Jerry DeMarco asks, can you explain the reasoning behind the neighborhood areas? In outlying areas, pink squares surrounded by yellow squares.
Yes. That is an intersection between the themes of neighborhoods and mobility. Those little pink squares are commercial areas intended to provide not only services, but also gathering spaces and we call them community nodes, places where people identify, oh, we're at such and such a place. Like people say, I'm at 19th and Main or something like that. All of those are located at intersections or anticipated intersections of major street networks. So those will be places that'll be easy to get to. People will be able to walk or bike or drive. Placing those in near proximity to those major streets also enables people to obtain services in a way that does not require a lot of extra travel. Examples of the kind of development you might see in those kinds of areas would be Southtown Square, like is recently developed at the intersection of Kagi and Wilson, Kagi South 3rd Wilson. So those are anticipated to probably be smaller scale local service kinds of activities. The larger block pink areas also located at those major arterials are more the larger community scale, like you might see along 19th Avenue or something where you might have a full-scale grocery store, other kinds of major employers, things like that. The orange square that goes around the pink square, the orange represents a mixed use area to provide some buffer. It's about a block deep roughly between the commercial uses and adjacent areas that are designated for residential.
Okay. Amy McNulty asks, can you speak to the reasoning for proposing an industrial district changing from residential use for the area of 19th and Goldenstein?
Yes. There are several thoughts in there. One is when we look at the future growth of the community and you look at the very large areas that are designated as residential, those folks need to work somewhere. Those folks need certain services that we all use every day. When we look at where to place those kinds of uses, we're looking at a challenging balance of finding good transportation access, utility accessibility, the character of the land itself. Trying to put a business park on a hill is pretty challenging. Bozeman has an awful lot of water courses that cross it, and trying to dodge all the streams becomes a real challenge in the design of a development. So when we started looking for areas within the planning area that had reasonably flat ground, reasonable transportation and utility access, less limitations based on the natural features, so that would have less damage on wetlands or water courses, There were very, very few of them, frankly. And one of them happened to be there at 19th and Goldenstein. 19th is a major street. Ultimately, over maybe the next 100 years, who knows? We anticipate it will be 5 lanes all the way south. Goldenstein is an arterial street that goes east-west and connects obviously from Sourdough and goes a long ways to the west. If you look at both the county's and the city's transportation plan, it's going to carry a lot of traffic. It won't be as big as 19th. So it's got the transportation side. It's within the city's reasonably nearby planning area for water and sewer. It does not have much in the way of environmental limitations. And frankly, all of our industrial property is pretty much up on the north side at this point. So there's very little on the south side to provide those kinds of services without running people many miles to get to those kinds of services. So as we look at all the various factors, those all come into play. And when you look at the land use map, purple is the industrial designation. It was pretty much all aligned along the railroad tracks because that's what people were thinking of as industrial a long time ago. Today, industrial is as likely to be an office building or something that looks like an office building as it is a big freight yard. And so the ability to place those away from things like the railroad tracks is greater than what it used to be.
All right. Jerry DeMarco asks, is the city going to advocate at the state level for a comprehensive land use plan?
Not quite sure what that question means. If he's asking about a statewide land use plan, that would be a legislative priorities question for the city commission. I am not aware of us advocating for something like Washington or Oregon do, where there's compulsory statewide planning. It's been thought about, I know, by some folks, but I've not heard it being taken up by the legislature.
He says, as in Oregon.
Yeah, not that I'm aware of, but that would be a good question directly for a city commissioner.
Okay. Just skimming. I think we've answered all of the questions, just double checking.
Okay. Which is good timing because I see we've hit the end of our hour.
Yeah, if you feel like a question was missed, feel free to resubmit, but.
And we will have an opportunity to ask further questions on the 30th. We're going to try and kind of catch questions that have come in between now and then, as well as cover both some land use map as well as text information. So there is opportunities yet to bring in questions. And if you're interested in helping us with the poll that's up on the screen, help us understand how we're doing on this, we would appreciate your input. We encourage folks to submit comments. Very much interested in receiving those. Thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.
We'll hang out and give people an opportunity to respond.
Okay. I see we had a number of call-in users this time, more so than I think we did last time. I don't know that that means anything, but always interesting to see who's connecting.
Yeah, the call-in users aren't able to participate. That if they're on audio only, they're not able to indicate that they'd like to ask questions or participate in the poll.
Mhm.
Yeah, technology limits. Kind of
They can hear the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Most people have dropped off there, Lacey, but hopefully we've got a few folks to respond to the poll.
Thanks for putting in the feedback link as well, Lacey. I think that will hopefully be helpful for people. And thank you for recording it. I forgot to hit that button when we started.
And Chris, I intended to at least step in and try to answer one question to give your voice a opportunity to recover, but you jumped in pretty quickly on most of them. But well done.
Chris was
Thank you.
on fire.
Yeah, sorry about that. I should have let you have a turn.
No, not necessary, but figured I'd try to give you a reprieve for a moment.
All right. Well, looks like we got about 2 minutes left on the poll. Folks have that opportunity. Maybe this isn't the right forum for it, but I would be interested in trying out that Jamboard methodology that Danny and Melody showed us for a project sometime. I think there's some potential there I've seen a lot of things that people have done with sticky notes in engagement that's been very effective and helping folks see ideas and group concepts and stuff. Be interesting to see how that shakes out.
Yeah, that was a cool tool. All right, I think it's safe to say we've had our poll participants, so
I think you're likely correct.
I'll go ahead and close this.
All right. Thank you for the assistance.
Yeah, thank you, Lacey.
Lacey?
Well done getting those questions out there and keeping us on track with that. That's great.
No problem. Thanks, guys.
We'll see you folks later.